Hi, my name is John, and I created this verse-by-verse scripture commentary for those who would like to thoughtfully expand their study of the scriptures beyond basic gospel principles. I think this would be particularly helpful for teachers who would like to find a way to engage more meaningfully with the text and with their students. I've certainly designed this from the perspective of having held many teaching callings within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is designed to move from the milk-based diet, which the Apostle Paul talks about and warns against beyond initial conversion, and into a more meat-based diet that requires more thoughtful chewing, swallowing, and digesting of the Word of God. Welcome. Today we are in chapter 4 of Genesis at the end of Cain's genealogy. We've kind of read through the first part of it. We are in verse 23 now, and we'll just go ahead and pick up right here in verse 23. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Verse 24, If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Okay, I have just written this section out on the board, and as you can see, it follows a pattern. You may not necessarily recognize this as you read through, but scholars agree that this is probably a fragment poem. We've talked about how the story of Cain and Abel is probably older than the story of Adam and Eve, and some of the stories in Genesis are stitched together to kind of create this pseudo-harmonious narrative. This is a poem that may be really, really old and completely disconnected from the story of Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel at all, but it's inserted here into the text. We know this is a poem, of course, because if you've done even like a freshman course in creative writing or poetry, you know the symmetry and the patterns of poetry. So this would be an A, B, A, B type poem. Then we move into a C, D, C, D. And then this would be like an E, F, probably G, F, which is why I've made that a different color. So it repeats kind of a similar idea where you see the letters match up. There's probably not a whole lot of commentary on the poem itself or the fact that a poem is inserted here into this section. Hebrew writing, it's very common to have poetic sections kind of sprinkled through any literary work. So this makes sense that this appears here. I don't know in what context this fragment would have been prior to being stitched into this story, but there are a few things that we could say about the content of this poem and why it might be serving a rhetorical purpose here as a literary device. So we did talk about how the content of the end of the beginning of Genesis chapter 4 into Cain's exile and beyond. We're getting into this thematic narrative that Genesis has been implicitly establishing this argument that civilization leads to a kind of moral degeneration. What you have here is this man Lamech, and we talked last episode a bit about the fact that he is the first polygamous man introduced in the biblical text. It doesn't portray the polygamy itself as particularly evil or amoral, but it does present it in the context of this continuing degenerative, far away from God narrative. And what Lamech is doing here is that he's boasting, he seems to be boasting that he has killed someone or maybe multiple people for minor or otherwise disproportionate offenses. So this word here, wounding or wound, it is the Hebrew word pesah. which literally means like a cut. At worst, it could be a gash. And then this word here, hurt, is the Hebrew word habara, which means like a welt or a bruise. And Lamech here is again, he's boasting about the fact that he has or he would. It's not sure the way the poetry is reading. Um, I think most scholars read this as he has done these things. I think there's a way to maybe argue poetically that he's saying he would do these things, but that if someone is to give him a cut or a gash or even something as simple as a bruise, that he would kill someone disproportionately for wronging him in that way. To add the cherry on top of this disproportional justice, which would be injustice, this word here is different than this word here. And that's why some scholars have said this is probably, perhaps, talking about two different people. This is a full-grown man. This is the Hebrew word yeled, which can literally mean a child or a boy. So think about that just proportionally. He's saying if a child were to strike me and give me some kind of a welt or a bruise, that he would go as far as to kill that child. And again, this is found in the context of Genesis chapter 4, essentially making this sort of polemic statement against growing society and civilization, saying people are getting further and further away from the presence of God and therefore further away from godliness itself. And when Lamech boasts of essentially saying, hey, if Cain is going to be avenged sevenfold, then I, Lamech, the great Lamech, I will be avenged 70 and sevenfold. Which essentially is what he's saying is he is untouchable, or at least he thinks he is. And he feels completely justified in whatever actions he has to take against someone who would remotely, even slightly hurt him. And if you think about this sevenfold thing, remember we had a whole kind of episode about how this was not really a curse. This was a divine kind of protection over Cain. And what Lamech is doing is he's taking this sort of divine sevenfold protection and he's twisting it into his own corrupt, idealized, violent justice, which again would be injustice. The other thing I want to point out here too is who's his audience? Who's he saying this to? He's just saying this to his wives. This isn't really serving any purpose. He's not drawing a boundary in the sand for somebody who is or might intimidate him. He's just sort of performing for his wives. He's acting as sort of this intimidation figure in his own household. At least that's how it reads to me. This would be sort of a sort of toxic presiding. It's the opposite of what true presiding, righteous presiding would look like. It's brutality, and important, it's brutality beyond Cain. This is worse than what we've even seen with Cain. So this kind of highlights a progression away from the presence of God. Adam and Eve disobeyed. They get sent out into exile away from God. Cain steps beyond that boundary. He has sinned further than Adam and Eve did. He gets pushed out further away from God. And so it kind of begs the narrative. What's happening here with Lamech? We see this character is even worse than Cain. He would kill a child just for bruising him, and he's being this bully almost to his wives for no apparent reason other than just boasting about himself, and he thinks he's untouchable. He is moving further and further away from the presence and the grace of God. And it probably highlights that the rest of civilization or the world around Lamech is probably acting that way as well. This isn't in my notes, and I'm hesitant to even say it because I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll just cut this out. But I think this language is later co-opted or adapted by Christ when he talks about forgiveness, right? So he says, you have heard it said, you should forgive your brother 7 times. I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. He doesn't say 70 and 7, but I think it's 70 times 7. And the principle I think that Jesus tries to demonstrate in this symbology is that your brother, your neighbor, should be spiritually, in terms of forgiveness, untouchable to you. That you should not remotely hold anything against them. You give that to the Lord. Let God be the judge. Let God judge who he will judge, forgive who he will forgive or not. And the Doctrine and Covenants talks about that too. But for you, it is required to forgive. So any offense against you is untouchable spiritually, in terms of forgiveness. So I do like how this symbology actually kind of evolves into a more positive Christological doctrine. Now, you may be wondering where all of this is leading, right? Is the purpose just to demonstrate that mankind is worse off without God? Perhaps. I think that's a huge part of it. But remember where we're going to get in just a couple of chapters. This is leading up to Genesis chapter 6 through like 8, 9, where you have the flood that God sends in to destroy all mankind because it grieved him in his heart. He regretted making mankind. I think in the King James, it actually says repenteth, that the Lord repented of making mankind, that he wished he could basically go back and undo it. And remember the reason for the flood. I think sometimes people forget that, or we insert our doctrinal or maybe even dogmatic ideas onto why God destroyed all of humanity. And it says it explicitly in chapter 6. It was that the intentions and desires of man's heart were violent all of the time, that all they could think about was destruction. And this is sort of foreshadowing a greater sociological problem that eventually God has to deal with in a very powerful way. We are now going to go into verse 25, and I do want to just mention something that as I was reading, it came to mind that I haven't mentioned this before, and it might be helpful, or there may be a question about it. If you're reading the King James Version, every once in a while, sometimes at the beginning of a chapter, sometimes in the middle of a chapter, as in this case, you'll come across this symbol. And it's the paragraph symbol. It looks something like that. The purpose of that symbol, it's actually a carryover from medieval scribes. So when you see this symbol pop up in the King James Version, it just means that once upon a time, some scribe somewhere thought that this was the beginning of a new section or a new idea. This does not indicate that there was a division in the original Hebrew, because most of the original Hebrew text was just completely blocks of text with no punctuation or divisions whatsoever. But it may be helpful for you to know that when you see that, it just means that someone somewhere who had something to do with the original composition of the text thought this is a new section or a new idea being presented here. And now we will read verse, let's start with 20. Well, we're at the end of the chapter here, so let's go 25 and 26. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also, there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. If you read through Genesis chapter 5 carefully, they will list out how long each patriarch lived, not just when they, their whole lives, like when they died. They will also say how old they were when they begat their firstborn sons, or the notable sons in their lineage. For Seth, when he begat Enos, I believe he was over 100 years old. Yeah, 105. And so the time it takes to travel between verse 23, 24, and then 25 and 26, we're covering dozens and dozens of years. Following the pattern we've seen with naming children before in the book of Genesis, and you will find this throughout Hebrew scripture. It has something to do with the circumstances of the conception or the birth, or something about when that child was young. Seth just means appointed. It can also mean set before. More specifically, set or to set, and the implication would be to set before something or set before someone. It can also mean to grant, like to grant unto someone. And the reason for this is said explicitly in the text, that Seth is essentially a sort of replacement for Abel. And remember, Eve is the one naming. She's done this before. Very common for the wives or the midwives to name children. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again since we're here. This has to do with dominion, meaning stewardship, responsibility, and most importantly, authority. If you name something, or if you're granted the right to name something in Hebrew culture, you have authority over that thing or over that person. And so when Adam names Eve, he has authority over her. He will have dominion over her and he will rule over her. Well, when Eve names her children, that means she has dominion, stewardship, responsibility, and authority over her children. Not always the way we hear about presiding. We tend to think of the head of the household as someone who presides over all of the household. Maybe that's true to some degree, but in the ancient mind, the mother or the midwife was the person who had that divine authority over children. So when she names her son Seth, or appointed, she says it explicitly, for God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. This word seed in Hebrew, zerah, it can mean offspring, but I think in the context of chapter 4, and definitely as we get into chapter 5, it means lineage. This is really important. It's important because Eve is not just saying, hey, I've gotten like a replacement kid. Oh, isn't it such a bummer? My kid died, so now God's given me a replacement one. It's as if Abel never died. He's a replacement. Or I think sometimes it can read maybe a little cold like that. If you think about seed in terms of lineage, this has greater implications because remember, Adam and Eve are still looking ahead for the Savior. There is something promised in the lineage. There's something special about a righteous lineage, and this is something that comes up repeatedly throughout the Hebrew text. When Abel died, obviously no lineage for him. His line stops, and the only line that we have now is Cain's line. What's the problem with that, though? Cain's gone out into exile. He's now this nomadic wanderer. He's out there building civilizations that are farther and farther away from the presence of God and from godliness itself. And in fact, he has been cursed, and he has committed violence. He's committed an atrocity. And so Cain's lineage is essentially not a candidate for anything righteous because it has been corrupted. So what is being promised here in Seth's line is that this is, to use a Latter-day Saint term, this is a restoration of Abel's lineage. In other words, all of the righteous people that may have been from Abel can now be again through Seth. That becomes very important. And this verse ends any discussion about the lineage of Cain. We open up chapter 5, and what do we go into? The lineage of Seth. And so we've concluded with Cain. We're moving on to Seth's lineage. And Seth eventually, down the line, gives way to Noah, who becomes a major player here. Through him, he and his family are the righteous remnant of basically a world full of wicked Cainites. And so that is what I think is being implied here when Eve says, instead of Abel, or a replacement of Abel. It's a restoration of a righteous lineage through whom humanity can continue. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't it also? I think you might have mentioned in an earlier video that Abel might have had a wife, just like Cain, had a wife, and I believe in Jewish culture at some point, at least, in the Bible, it mentions that if a wife's husband died, then the brother would then produce what's
I
necessary to
have
have a
never
child.
thought of that.
But in that way, that child is still like the brother is doing the duty to put a child in the line of his deceased brother for the wife. So could it be something? Explain it better because you're going to explain
No, well, I
it
think
better.
that's I'd never thought of that. If we're treating this as a history, this is so much earlier than any of
Yeah.
that law was ever established. It would almost be irrelevant. Um, this is all it's all speculative anyway, too, because we just don't know if Abel had a wife. That's
Mm-hmm.
just, my only reason for saying that was, if Cain had a wife, why couldn't Abel have a wife too?
Yeah. I was
Um,
just saying like.
and the reason of I think the reason for speculating on that is because he was concerned about someone killing him,
Mm-hmm.
and normally that blood guilt applied to kin. And so it's like, where are these people coming from? You could think these were outside civilizations, but if you were attaching it to blood guilt, really the only people that would be avenging that blood would be either descendants of Abel or Adam and Eve themselves. I think that's the reason I was speculating, but that's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting. At first, I thought you were saying Cain basically stole Abel's wife and now took her and they're out in exile. I had never thought of that, but it could be that yeah. Let's suppose that Abel had a wife, then Seth could marry Abel's widow, and then propagate this new righteous line. That's
Well,
very
because
possible.
that would, in the Levitical tradition, that would be a restoration of Abel's lineage. That's
It would
providing
be.
Abel's wife with a lineage through,
It would be a restoration of Abel's lineage if that is the case. Of course, speculation, but that's really insightful. I really appreciate you saying that.
Seth is providing the restoration of Abel's lineage, and we wonder, like, oh, could this have been hinting of that later tradition where you literally impregnate your dead brother's wife in order to give your dead brother a line of inheritance in their culture?
Yeah, and if this was under any kind of, if this had been under Levitical law, that's absolutely what it would have been. It's a great insight. So then we get to Seth's son. Here he's first in Seth's lineage, Enos. So we're looking for the meaning of Enos, because it says here in the verse, um, he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. You would maybe think Enos means to call upon. It doesn't. Call upon is a word, hual, or huhal. Enos just means like mortal, or it could specifically mean fragile, like a fragile state. It can mean human in the sense of like a mortal human, but it certainly has a context of like, or a connotation of frailty or weakness. And that is really interesting in the context of like, this is when men began to call upon the name of the Lord. What I think this is perhaps getting at is that there is some kind of a revival happening, some kind of a spiritual revival. Oops, it would be helpful if I could spell that right. Revival. And you do see this pop up. You do see revival in dark times. Often, when civilization and violence starts to abound, it is when people begin to seek God. So, to call upon, huhal. This could mean prayer. It could mean ritual. It could mean any kind of organized worship. And I want to dive into this a little bit because we read this, especially as restorationists. And when we start looking at religious revival, we go, oh, this is a really positive thing. This is a great thing. People are beginning to call upon the name of the Lord. They're seeking God. Well, keep in mind that prayer and ritual and organized worship can also be apostate. It can be non covenantal. The significance of Seth's son being named Enos, that is to say, a mortal, fragile, frail, weak human being, in the context of now humans, these mortal, fragile, weak human beings are beginning to call upon the name of the Lord, could indicate that worship is being performed out of fear and out of a loss of control. On the other end of things in society, sometimes you see it emerging after prosperity or maybe victory or conquest of some kind. We thank God or we thank the gods for our success. It inspires people to be religious because they have gained something positive. Again, that could be apostate and non covenantal as well. But in this case, it seems to be, at least in the context of how Genesis chapter 4 is being presented, that humankind is progressing further and further and further away from God. People are getting more violent. There are people more violent than Cain, and civilization is building, society is building, and they're making weapons now, and they have different culture, and they have art, and all this stuff that's not connected to covenant. And now in this context, you have what could be perhaps a righteous line, but you have people who are beginning to call upon God in that atmosphere. And it does seem to me to imply it could be out of fear, it could be out of a loss of control. When I read this and as I was preparing for this lesson, I just was reminded when I was very young and 9/11 happened. And it's so interesting to look back on the stats of how many people were in church the next Sunday and the Sunday after that. And for months after the fact, there was a huge spike in church attendance. I don't remember the actual numbers, but basically, this is a human kind of nature thing. When our illusion of stability starts to crack, or worst case, crumble, people start reaching for meaning. They start reaching for transcendence, to connect with something that maybe has answers, something that's bigger than the problems that they're facing. And it's not bad, but it's not necessarily righteousness. And that's an important distinction to make. When you go to a funeral that's held in a church, especially if the deceased person was particularly religious, what do you normally hear at the funeral? You hear some kind of gospel message. You hear some kind of hope for the afterlife, some kind of reassurance that these people are in a better place and you can be too. Again, it's not necessarily bad, but it's sort of like a situational righteousness, right? People who are grieving, for example, are generally more ready to hear about a message of a God that presides over an afterlife and you can be with your loved ones again, things like that. And I know from personal experience, having served as a ward missionary on a couple of occasions and working very closely with full time proselytizing missionaries, a lot of people are more willing to study with the missionaries when they are in hard times. I've seen it so often, right? Where the missionaries are getting to know somebody. Well, what brought you into our sphere? You know, why did you reach out to the missionaries? Why are you willing to take lessons with us? And I've heard it so much. They have a new job, or they just lost their job. They experienced a death in the family. They're going through a financial hardship. They just got diagnosed with some kind of illness. Current events are stressing them out. Natural disasters. There was a fire. Things like that tend to bring people closer to religion and the concept of God in general. I was doing some more research, and it looks like there's a lot of polls that suggest somewhere between 30 and 40% of adults say that a religious experience significantly increased importance during or after a major life crisis. Here's the important caveat to that. It looks like only about 10 to 20% experience a lasting conversion or a change in religious identity. And take something like grief, because that's just something I mentioned. You go through many stages of grief, right? That's just a human nature, and it's been very well documented and studied. I think traditionally there's like 5 stages of grief. Maybe new science has added one or two to that, new psychology. But one of the stages, almost always, is people go through this bargaining phase. They call it the bargaining phase, where they are trying their best to reckon with and reconcile with whatever they're grieving over. And a lot of times that bargaining will take the form of religious bargaining. Dear God, I promise if you heal my mother of her cancer, I'll be in church every Sunday. I'll sit in that pew every Sunday, I promise, right? There's a religious bargaining that starts to occur when hard times hit. Psychology seems to confirm these patterns pretty widely in religious contexts. All right, we are now in Genesis chapter 5. Can you believe it? I think we've been in chapter 4 for 4 hours or something like that. We'll start with verse 1 and 2, and then we'll probably just read the whole chapter because it's mostly genealogy with just a few road stops, pit stops along the way. Verses 1 and 2. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. We've seen this word before, the generations. Or in Hebrew, toledat. You see it something like a dozen times. There was a video where I listed all the instances of it in the book of Genesis. It's just a structural division of lineage. The word toledat refers to a lineage of things that happen after it. In Genesis chapter 2, we saw the toledat of the heavens and the earth. Essentially, what comes from the heavens and the earth? Human beings. Now we have the toledat of Adam, which is the lineage of Adam. I also like how the chapter starts out by just kind of reminding the reader of how it started, that God created man in his likeness, man and woman, male and female, in his likeness. It's saying, here's how it started, versus kind of this contrast that we've had in chapter 4 versus how it's going, right? We may have forgotten because we've talked a lot about how far humanity has fallen. Not just the garden, that was just the beginning of the fall. Cain fell even further, Lamech fell even further, and civilization as a whole is getting further and further away from God. And the writers of Genesis say, pause, let's just remind you where this started. This began with creation, and this began with order, divine order. Adam, we talked about this a little bit. Adam is not just a guy's name. It happens to be his name, but Adam is humanity. It is the name that God gave to the human species. So that's why it says male and female were both called Adam. All right, I hate to do this to you. I try not to read bulk sets of verses, but I do want to be able to say by the time we get done with all of this that we have actually read through every verse in the Old Testament and through the standard works. It is the goal. There's not a lot of commentary that I can do verse by verse here. It just kind of makes sense to take the entire lineage as a bulk and talk about it. So we're going to read verses 3 through 32. And maybe it would help if I normally don't do this because I like to read the verse, then talk about it. But just because this is such a huge section, I am going to kind of write some stuff on the board as we read. And maybe that will help capture your attention as we go. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image. So again, I don't normally comment before we're done reading the section, but just to hit stop here. In the way that God created Adam in his own likeness and image, now mankind is doing the same thing for their lineage. So it's showing this kind of divine mirror image that Adam is now doing what God himself did. God created in his image. Now Adam is creating in his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and then he died. I'll just say lifespan over here. This will be my lifespan column. And Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. And Seth lived after he begat Enos 807 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. And Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalaleel. I'm realizing now I left out another AL. Not a common name. Not Mahalaleel. Mahalaleel. Say that a few times fast. And Canaan lived after he begat Mahalaleel 840 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalaleel lived 65 years and begat Jared. And Mahalaleel lived after he begat Jared 830 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalaleel were 895 years, and he died. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God. We're taking a little pit stop here. Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and he did not die. At least that's not what the text says. Or rather, the text does not say, and he died. Important distinction. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. We'll come back to that. And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years. And he died. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, the same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years. And he died. Noah was 500 years old when he begat his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Seems to imply he had them all kind of at the same time when he was 500 years. So triplets, who's to say? It says later, I think towards the end of chapter 8 or 9, as we get towards the end of the flood myth and they've landed on Mount Ararat, Noah lives 950 years before he dies. Let's just talk about the lineage for a second. So I have seen it on like commentaries and just various like discussions about the lineage of Adam, that if you take the names of all of them, it spins or weaves some kind of narrative, that there's some kind of message hidden in there. Remember, I talked about this a little bit with chapter 4 when we talked about the lineage of Cain. And I did specifically list out the names and the meanings of the names of all of those in Seth's or in Cain's line, but was very clear that maybe we shouldn't be looking for a code or some kind of hidden message. Yes, there are probably literary themes that the meanings of these names are probably doing something for the story that's being told, but not that there's something deeper beyond that that you have to like have some kind of esoteric or gnostic understanding to be able to understand. And the reason I say this is this gets turned into some kind of messianic message. I've seen it happen where they take all these names and they basically say this is a prediction of Jesus Christ. And in my opinion, it is no such thing. If you are interested in the names, I'm happy to write them out. And you can see maybe some of the literary themes that are going into this story about civilization getting further away from God. We have a righteous line that has been restored. And we're getting to a place where we have the person who is going to be responsible for the remnant of humanity, the person that is able to keep humanity alive amid a great destruction. Adam means human, from the ground, more specifically. Seth means appointed. Enos means mortal or fragile or weak, frail. Canaan, we've already seen the first part of that name before, which is acquired. Maybe some kind of like possession, to have something. And also has a connotation of like a smith, like a blacksmith or some kind of an iron worker. To add the A in at the end of it, it's really unknown what this means. Some linguists have even said this could be as innocuous as meaning like a nest, but no one is really sure. Mahalalel means praise of God. Jared means to descend. Enoch means to dedicate. That's right, because Cain had a son also named him Enoch, and he dedicated his first city after him. So there's another Enoch in the line of Seth now. Methuselah is also unknown, just nobody knows. Best guess, man of the spear. This could play into the fact that we've seen now weapons are being made. Um, this could play into the narrative, the literary narrative here that we have of mankind becoming more violent. If you watch the oh, what was it? It was a Hollywood production of Noah. We watched that together with it was Russell Crowe and Emma Watson was in it. Um, I think they take heavily from like apocryphal Enoch rather than the book of Genesis. But this theme kind of comes up of like mankind are learning how to make weapons. I think in the book of Enoch, especially, there's this idea of like fallen angels coming down and teaching mankind how to make weapons and how to wage war against each other. So it could be implying that there's this theme of people are getting more and more violent, which again, our very next chapter, chapter 6, we're getting into God regretting that he has made mankind because they've become so violent. Lamech, also unknown. We've seen this name before. This is a different Lamech, but we think it could mean like strong or powerful. And then we have Noah, where they say explicitly his name basically means comfort, to comfort us in blah, blah, blah. They kind of say it. We'll talk about it. But it literally means rest or to settle something. So again, I don't know that you could like weave this to mean anything other than maybe there's some literary highlights to pick up on. Talking a little bit about the ages you see here. Of course, those who interpret the Bible to be hyper literal, they're going to have to sit with the fact that people are living hundreds of years. And how is that possible? We know that human lifespans have never been that long. In fact, if anything, human lifespans were a lot shorter long time ago. They're a lot better now because of modern medicine. Oh, sure.
This was my own theory as a child.
Okay.
So yeah, we don't have to share this, but
we can share it if you want.
I just think it's kind of funny. When I was a kid, I learned about genetics, and basically aging is your cells, they keep replicating throughout your life, but with each replication, there is some damage to your chromosomes. They don't replicate perfectly, and eventually they just get to the point where the cells are just they just don't work anymore. And that's usually when you're aging and then you just die because your cells can't replicate properly anymore.
Sure.
Basically, the copy of a copy of a copy, doesn't work. And so when I was reading the Bible as a child, knowing that, I thought, well, maybe, if Adam was created by God, he had perfect genetics, and so maybe they were able to live that long because telomeres used to be like telomeres are the ends of your chromosomes, and it's basically just junk DNA that's like a cap, and so that you're able to have more replications because it breaks down the telomere bit before the important bits,
sure,
closer to the middle. And so I thought, well, maybe their telomeres were like super long, and
yeah,
so they're able to just like keep replicating and live for so much longer. And now after all these hundreds of years, then like our telomeres aren't as good anymore, and aren't as long. That's why we can't live as long. But then it starts to fall apart pretty quick as you look and you see like, okay, lifespan, because lifespan originally it's like, oh, it's getting shorter and shorter, and then it's like, okay, it's getting a little higher, getting shorter again, and then it's 962 years, so it's even longer than Adam's lifespan. And then it's just going back down, and then it's suddenly 700 years. That's it, and it's like, okay, it kind of falls apart.
So that's the problem with a hyperliteral, any kind of hyperliteral interpretation of this is you have to figure out what are these numbers telling us. It's one thing if this is a pattern of completely descending numbers, but it's not, like you're mentioning. They kind of jump around a little bit. So yeah, your theory was that this was somehow genetic.
I was, as a child, I was trying to think, how could this be possible? Is it possible that
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're just their cells were more perfect than ours, and so they were able to replicate longer before breaking down to inoperable chromosomes?
Sure. And I think that's a very, again, if you're reading this in a hyperliteral way, why wouldn't that be an idea, right? One that I heard when I was growing up in evangelical environments is that the firmament over the earth, which they would interpret as like some kind of atmosphere, before before the flood waters came down, that it was like a greenhouse effect. So it was like a much stronger atmospheric barrier than it was pre-flood because the floodwaters weakened it. And so prior to Noah, the firmament created this bubble effect where everything had longer, it was just everything had better longevity. So the plants lived longer, they were healthier, and human beings did too. And they point to these obscure skeletons that they can find where the people grew bigger in these regions. And they say, look, Adam and Eve would have actually been giants compared to us
Like
because their
Neanderthals
yep,
over
because their
here.
bones were stronger and the firmament. Yeah, okay, so that was an idea.
I
Silly,
thought
silly, in my
my
opinion.
other theory as a child was that maybe they just didn't tell time. Like maybe their version of a year was like our version of a
Oh,
month, because
sure, okay.
like how would they tell time properly, or how would their year compare to what we understand a year to be?
Yeah, so is the calendar different? That's a good idea. One that I came up with, as I was reading through this, and I think I was trying to create this hybrid, like hybrid literal. I was trying to be the best of both worlds. That is my downfall, I think, most of the time. Um, I thought maybe these are tribes because it says as you go in the genealogy with every single one of them, and they begat sons and daughters, right? So it got me thinking maybe the tribe of Adam uh, had domain for 930 years. And then they passed the wand off to, or the baton off to Seth. And the tribe of Seth and all of his sons and daughters, they reigned for 912 years. So maybe this isn't a literal exact descent at all, but that these were the predominant tribes in the line of Adam and Seth. That was something that came to mind. That was my way
That actually
of trying to make it make sense.
that makes the most sense to me. Actually, that's a really good theory because then,
I don't agree with my own theory anymore,
well, because like
but
imagine if it took 130 years of the tribe of Adam before Seth figure rose up and was like, "I'm gonna make my own tribe
that's
over
what yeah,
here."
that was my
That's a
reasoning.
really fun idea. I like
It
that.
is a fun idea. Let's talk about ancient Near Eastern myth, what we always come back to and what Genesis is always pulling from. Why would this be any exception? In ancient Near Eastern myth, you have a document. Let's just do it here. The ancient Near Eastern SKL is how I abbreviated my notes. It's the Sumerian King List. This is a very famous document that would have been well known to the writers of Genesis. This Sumerian King List was a mythological list that depicted a few things. First, it depicted kings being descended from some kind of divine source. This Sumerian King List was also around 8 to 10 names. So there were 8 to 10 kings listed on this list. It varies depending on the fragment that you're looking at, but that is a very good ballpark. There are, depending on where you start counting this, from Adam or Seth, and then does it end at Noah or does it end at Shem, Ham, and Japheth? There's somewhere between 8 and 11 names on this list. Remember that the Sumerians also had a flood myth, and it was specifically stated in the Sumerian king list that this was pre-flood. And most importantly, because these were very special divine kings, or divinely descended or divinely appointed kings, They lived and reigned for thousands of years. This was this was drawing from other Mesopotamian primeval lore, particularly pre-flood myth lore. If you compare the two, Genesis is actually quite restrained in comparison, specifically you looking at how long they live. The ancient idea of longevity is that the longer you lived, the closer you were either to creation or the closer you were to the gods or a god. If you have a short life, it means distance from, well, in this case, distance from the Eden story, right? So if you're reading this, if you're an ancient Israelite, let's say, and you're reading this story, well, you as an ancient Israelite, you're only living 50, 60, 70 years. And you're reading this, you understand the myth and the lore pertaining to ancient Near Eastern concepts of longevity. This is a way of saying we're really far from Eden. This is their way of basically saying it's our equivalent of a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's just their origin story. The important thing, too, is that nobody reaches 1,000 because we've talked about 1,000 relating to divine magnitude. And it's almost divine in nature because 1,000 represented something that you couldn't even fathom, something you couldn't imagine. A couple of people get close, like Methuselah, but they never actually reach 1,000 because that was a God number. That was something that represented almost eternity. So this is almost anachronistic. This is one of the anachronisms of the book of Genesis, where you can tell this is actually influenced by much later Jewish numerology. In my current, I suppose, more academic or skeptical opinion, this is not a code. This is not data. This is not talking about actually anybody who lived a certain amount of time. Maybe not talking about real historical figures whatsoever. This is just pulling from existing literary themes and existing myth in their contemporary world. What's really interesting to me is that if you pull up the Sumerian king list and you count down the list to number 7, you end up with a figure called En-Men Durama. He's this mysterious figure who received some kind of divine wisdom and was, wouldn't you know it, taken to heaven. So I think this is, and that's just a huge coincidence not to be, I mean, knowing that we're drawing this from like existing myth and lore and to have that match up perfectly, I think, yeah, we're definitely borrowing from existing cultures. And now that we're talking about that, let's talk a little bit about Enoch or Enoch. He walked with God, it says. They want us to know he walked with God so much they say it twice. I think they say it twice to really emphasize that he was truly exceptional. This phrase, and he was not, you find that sometimes in Hebrew literature. You find that in the Bible occasionally. It indicates some kind of sudden disappearance. It could indicate a divine removal. It could also just indicate death. And it really depends on the context in which it is said. And I want to just be really precise on how we're saying this, because the phrase, he was not, is not necessarily an indicator that he didn't die. It also doesn't mean ascend to heaven, right? Its basic meaning is that it's a relocation of some kind. But more importantly, it does not mean that he didn't die. That phrase, he was not, for the Lord took him, it could have meant that he just had some kind of an honorable death outside of the community. Now, this differs from the account of Elijah, for example, because in this account, you don't have really a description of what happened. It's very vague, it's very ominous. There's no description of an event, there's no witnesses of an event, and it doesn't tell you where he went. And the Bible's silence on this really expanded a kind of lore and myth around this figure, this character of Enoch. Second Temple Judaism, they expanded him into this kind of immortal, heavenly scribe, this cosmic mediator. They start writing about him in books like First Enoch, books like Jubilees. We even have some Latter-day Saint lore about him and scripture in the book of Moses. But that lore developed, especially in Second Temple Judaism, because the Bible is silent on it, not because it's indicating one thing or another. But rabbinic Judaism, midrashic tradition, they really like to expand upon vague, ambiguous stuff like this. Moses has a similar phrase said about him, and basically some kind of mysterious burial. And again, you get into Second Temple Judaism, and they expand on that. They create lore about it to the point where it actually works itself into the New Testament. You go read the book of Jude, there's this reference to an apocryphal book of, oh, what is it? I think it's called The Assumption of Moses. And Jude actually references the archangel Michael disputing with Satan over Moses's body, because the way it's said in the Old Testament is like, we just don't know where he is. We don't know what happened to him. And so people, I mean, especially people who want to read something spiritual into things, they say, oh, well, that means he ascended into heaven. It means God swept him off of his feet and took him to heaven, and he didn't die. He's immortal or something like that. But just to be clear, that's not necessarily what that phrase always means. Okay, Noah means rest, comfort, settle. It could mean relief. And it says in the text, that's why they name him Noah. His name shall be Noah. The same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. So Noah represents some kind of relief from collective suffering. And that suffering is umbrellaed under a bunch of things like work and toil and the curse on the ground, which includes death. So relief from work, pain, and death. In other words, relief from humanity's exile that we've seen demonstrated through chapter 4. Not just exile from Eden, but exile from God. And Noah somehow represents a relief from that distance. Now I look at Lamech's kind of pronouncement of that name on Noah. I look at the life of Noah. I look at the outcome and what comes after. And I do wonder, I do tend to gravitate towards, I think this is like, it's aspirational, it's hopeful. I don't think it's prophetic. Because in what reality did Noah ease any kind of collective suffering on the things that were mentioned there? Noah preserves life, yes. Humanity, according to the story, humanity comes from him and his family through his sons. But work continues, pain continues, death continues. One argument I could see being made for the fact that Noah offers this sort of collective relief is that once the ark settles, that flood is over, he sort of reboots the agricultural world post flood. And God, in chapter 8, specifically promises predictable seasons and good harvests. So, like, the curse on the ground isn't undone by any means, but it is contained after Noah. Since God has cleansed the land, there is now a containment of that curse, and humanity can kind of continue on. I do think this is perhaps a great insert into maybe a gospel principle message. It's a simple one, but it's that the comfort that people are looking for, people like Lamech who pronounce this name on Noah, and this is my aspiration, this is my desire. That comfort that people are looking for is presented in the scriptures as Christ's atonement and the promise of the Spirit to be with us. And I would say that even now, I mean, okay, we're way beyond this. Even now, present day, 21st century, this curse of, well, I don't need to even write it down because we've talked about it, but this curse of toil, work, pain, death, all of that is still very much with us. And we're waiting, right? We're waiting for this eternal comfort, for the full measure of relief. And in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we tend to place that on the power of the atonement. We say the atonement doesn't just cover sin, but it covers all of this stuff. It covers the pain and the sorrows that we experience day in and day out. And we look forward with hope and with aspiration to the realization of those blessings. And I think that's perhaps a little bit of what's going on here. That is the conclusion of our lesson, and we are now properly in chapter 6. We'll be beginning with chapter 6. I don't think we've ever gotten through a whole chapter in one video, so maybe that's a good omen for us going forward. I will leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ.